The Battle of Grunwald in 1410, one of the largest of its kind in medieval Europe. It has been immortalized in literature, film and national memory, certainly Polish. And what are the myths and realities surrounding this titanic struggle? We still reenact this battle, so why does it still hold our imagination? Join me, Jan Darasz, for How We Got Here.
The black cross on a white tabard, the emblem of the Teutonic Knights, came to symbolize not help, protection and healing, as its bearers claimed, but a hunger for power and exploitation. The origins of the Teutonic Order stretch back to 1191, when a group of German merchants from Bremen and Lübeck took over a hospital in Acre, following the city's capture from the Ayyubids. The sick required care, and the group, calling itself the Hospital of St. Mary of the German House in Jerusalem, offered it. Pope Celestine III approved the order, which transformed into a military order in 1191. Headed by a Grand Master, the order quickly grew in influence across the Crusader states. In 1211, the order was invited to southeastern Transylvania to help repel the Cumans invading the Kingdom of Hungary. But while they pushed back the invaders, they also expanded their settlements, a red flag for Hungary's King Andrew II. In 1225, Andrew, backed by a papal bull from Pope Honorius III, claiming his authority over the order's territory in Transylvania, expelled the Teutonic Knights. Their next stop? The Helmnoland, invited by Duke Conrad I of Mazovia in 1226. He hired the knights to defend Poland's eastern borders and subdue the pagan Baltic Prussians. In return, they were granted a base for their mission in Helmno. The order carried out their tasks with flying colours, baptizing the Prussians with fire and sword. But unlike Hungary's King Andrew, Duke Conrad I and later other Polish rulers failed to foresee the consequences. The Teutonic Knights had come to stay, and soon turned their swords against the Christians. In 1308, Brandenburg forces captured Gdańsk to a great displeasure of Duke Władysław the Short, who laid claim to the city. The Teutonic Knights drove the Brandenburgians out and seized the city as their own. But the news of the Teutonic Knights slaughtering the Gdańsk townsfolk infuriated Władysław even further. Thus began an over 2 centuries-long feud that ended in the order's eventual decline.
I'm delighted to welcome our guest today, Tomasz Szumański. He's a custodian at the Polish Army Museum here in Warsaw. Welcome to the programme.
Hello.
First of all, can you give us a bit of context? The Teutonic Knights was an organisation, military and religious. Mm-hmm. Can you give us an idea of why this union between the two happened in medieval Europe?
It was the order of the Hospital of the Most Holy Virgin Mary of the German House in Jerusalem, because that was its full name, the Teutonic or German Order, and in Poland it was called the Order of the Cross because of the black cross worn on the white tunics or cloaks by the warrior monks. It was one of the last knightly orders established in Europe, alongside such famous orders as the Templars or the Knights Hospitaller. It has hospital in its name because, indeed, initially the main task of the monks was to provide aid to knights who fought in the Holy War. These were mainly knights who we would say today were of German origin, and when this mission of the knightly orders began to slowly come to an end, then the Teutonic Knights moved to a completely different place on the map of Europe.
They were invited by Duke Conrad of Mazovia. It's like inviting the mafia to sort out a problem, and they stay. How did the order manage these lands, conquer, and then how did it rule the lands that it conquered?
Above all, the Teutonic Order had its monastic houses, its seats scattered throughout Europe, mainly in the wealthy cities of Western Europe, which participated in the expeditions to the Holy Land. Hence, it enjoyed great popularity, great prestige, and interestingly, the King of Hungary was the first to learn about them and brought them to his country's borderlands. However, when the Teutonic Knights began not only to defend the lands of their sovereign granted to them as a fief, but started building their own state independent of the king, that was a red flag for the King of Hungary. He expelled them from his domain before they grew in strength. Meanwhile, the Duke of Mazovia, in divided Poland, needed armed force for battles with the pagan Prussians, who raided the borderlands of Mazovia. The Duke couldn't always count on help from his Piast cousins, who competed with him for the throne in Krakow. Therefore, the proposal to bring in these professional knights with excellent military organization was a brilliant idea. The Duke granted them the Chełmno land as a fief, and from this place they began their activity.
And did they get too powerful? They were a religious order that was subordinated to the Pope and to the religious authorities, but it seems to me that they got too powerful as a state. Is that an accurate?
Yes, definitely. One could say that the Teutonic Order swore loyalty to three different rulers. Obviously, as an order to the papacy, to Rome, as knights defenders of Christianity, to the Holy Roman Emperor of the German nation, and also to the Polish Duke, who gave them those lands as a fief. However, they began to grow in strength because the territories they conquered came under their influence. The lands of the former Prussians, Galdinians, and Estonians came under the rule of the Teutonic Knights, who, one could say, to some extent exterminated the local population. The rest they forcibly Christianized. They built a network of fortified castles, founded new cities, and brought in colonists, mainly from German countries, although in the initial period, Polish knights and Polish people from Mazovia also settled there. But at a certain point, the Teutonic Knights turned from helpers to enemies of Poland, especially when they treacherously seized Gdansk, the most important port, as it turned out, which was the gateway to Western Europe, and the Teutonic Knights, taking over Gdansk and Pomerania and imposing customs duties on Vistula trade, made life very difficult for their Polish neighbours.
How did the Teutonic Knights, the order, think of itself? We spoke earlier about us projecting our image of Poland and Germany, Teutonic Knights and Poland. Would the order have thought of itself as a German order or a German-speaking order, or something completely different?
I think we need to look at this from a completely different perspective. The Middle Ages, in colloquial speech, are associated with backwardness and superstition. In reality, very modern concepts prevailed then. One of them was, for instance, European universalism. So nationality was not the most important thing. What mattered more was which ruler, which dynasty one served, and above all, what was most important was what religion one professed. From this perspective, one could say that the Teutonic Knights did not deviate from the norm. They were indeed mostly of German origin, meaning they spoke German in their daily lives. But did they feel German? That's probably hard to explain or define, especially since their subjects were both Poles, Prussians, and those settlers who came from Western Europe, not only from Germany.
We'll come on to the actual battle in the next clip. So let's talk about the preparations and the causes of the war. And it was to be the cause of many wars between the state of Poland and the state of the authorities of Prussia. What was the cause? What were the causes chiefly of this war in particular that led to the Battle of Grunwald?
We've already talked about those frictions and conflicts between Poland and the Teutonic Order. The second factor was the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, ruled by the last pagan dynasty in Europe. It ruled large territories of Orthodox Rus, as well as pagan Lithuania itself. And of course, it entered into territorial disputes and conflict with the Teutonic state, which also in its ideology proclaimed Christianization, often by the sword. So Lithuania was their opponent opponent here, the Polish-Lithuanian Union and the peaceful Christianization of Lithuania, meant that essentially this casus belli, or the reason why the order should exist at all, ceased to exist. Moreover, the very subjects of the Teutonic state began to gravitate economically more and more toward Poland, because the largest cities such as Gdansk, Torun, Elbląg saw their interests rather in trade with Polish knights and goods shipped down the Vistula, which were then sent via the Baltic to Western Europe. This, you could say, is why the Teutonic Knights declared war. But King Władysław Jagiełło, together with Grand Duke Witold of Lithuania, preempted the Teutonic attack and struck at the heart of the monastic state, the capital Malbork, also called Marienburg in German.
And a final question before we move on. What are the numbers like? Because there's a controversy about the actual number of any medieval army. Do we know with a degree of certainty as to how large the order and how large the Polish-Lithuanian Ruthenian alliance was?
We know for sure that this was one of the largest battles in medieval Europe. We know for certain that at this moment, when it comes to exactly how many banners, that is units, were on each side, but when it comes to the numerical strength of individual units, that's something we can only estimate. It is accepted that the Teutonic side had about 21,000 knights, while the Polish-Lithuanian side had about 31,000. That's not counting the camp followers and soldiers who are not knights.
Okay, we'll move on to the actual battle now and its consequences for future history and historiography, and we'll have a look at our next clip.
With all of Pomerelia and the city of Gdańsk in Teutonic hands, Polish ruler Władysław I the Short found his lands detached from the Baltic Sea, a powerful geostrategic blow. Even though a papal court ruled in favour of the recently crowned king Władysław the Short in 1321, calling on the order to return Gdańsk and reimburse the king, the knights ignored the ruling and decided to enter the warpath. The order held its own during the reign of Casimir III the Great, Władysław's successor, who was forced to confirm the knights' control of Pomerelia in the 1343 Treaty of Kalisz. Meanwhile, the Teutonic Knights continued raiding pagan Lithuania under the pretense of missionary efforts. But in 1385, pagan ruler Grand Duke of Lithuania, Jogaila, signed the Union of Krewo. In fact, a prenup ahead of his forthcoming marriage with the Christian Polish Queen Jadwiga. Through that legal act, Lithuania embraced Christianity, thus undermining the order's justification of war. Regardless, fighting broke out in 1409 following the Teutonic Order's hostile acts, such as the failed attempts at breaking the Polish-Lithuanian alliance and the annexation of the Polish territory of Dobrzyn land. The final showdown took place in the fields of Grunwald on July 15, 1410. Both sides mustered considerable forces. The Polish-Lithuanian alliance, backed by various principalities, Ruthenians, today's Ukrainians and Belarusians, Moravians, Bohemians, Moldavia, and even a Golden Horde Tatar contingent. The Teutonic Knights enjoyed the support of Silesian princedoms, German crusaders, and some Hungarian troops. The order, sure of its might and advantage, presented the Polish king Władysław Jagiełło and Grand Duke Vytautas the Great, the Lithuanian commander, with two bare swords, as prescribed by custom. Thanks to a maneuver that distracted the Teutonic heavy cavalry, the Polish-Lithuanian forces overwhelmed the enemy forces, killing up to 211 out of the 270 members of the order who fought in the battle, including Grand Master Ulrich von Jungingen. But the victory in one of the largest battles of medieval Europe was not taken advantage of effectively. The Polish-Lithuanian forces were slow to advance toward the order's stronghold of Malbork, which gave the enemy time to brace for a siege. The Polish-Lithuanian forces laid the siege, but had to break it due to a non-Teutonic threat elsewhere. It took another century of wars with the order for the rapacious Teutonic Knights to swallow their pride and finally bend their knee before the Polish crown in what came to be known as the Prussian Homage of 1525.
We'll have a talk about the actual battle now. The image we have chiefly from films is of a medieval battle, is of two armies just running at each other in lots of mud, very crowded, very noisy. The Battle of Grunwald, as I understand it, had some strategic sense, some strategic thought. Could you describe how the battle unfolded on that day?
Yes, the Battle of Grunwald is indeed an example of this medieval clash that shows these battles were much more sophisticated. There was a certain guiding thought behind them, strategy, tactics, and the fighting sides faced each other in order, divided into smaller units, so-called banners, numbering between 100, 200, 300 knights, along with their retinue. And of course, they didn't attack with the entire mass on the commander's signal, but attacked with individual units, which after breaking their lances, long wooden spears, and drawing swords, fought off the enemy and tried to withdraw so that the next banner could enter the gap and strike with still unbroken lances. This manoeuvre was repeated. They tried to gain dominance in a given place on the battlefield. Here, it's also worth noting that before this clash with pole weapons, with lances, with swords, earlier the squires and knightly servants in the rear ranks showered the enemy with bolts shot from crossbows over the heads of their knights in the front ranks. Additionally, when it comes to the Battle of Grunwald itself, the Teutonic side occupied advantageous positions a day earlier. Meanwhile, the Polish-Lithuanian side was just arriving at the battlefield after previously looting and burning the town of Dąbrówno. So before the individual units were formed from this long marching column, several hours had to pass. The battle began around noon. For this reason, the units that took position earlier, the lighter ones constituting the vanguard of the troops, here I mean the Lithuanian, Ruthenian-Lithuanian troops, they began the battle first and also fought in a completely different way than Western European armies. They fought in the Tartar manner, that is, they drew the enemy in pursuit, showering them with arrows, dispersing as it were, so that the strike would hit empty space, and then on the commander's orders closing ranks again. And that's exactly what happened at the Battle of Grunwald.
The Polish-Lithuanian or Lithuanian-Polish, depending on which, if you're a Lithuanian historian or a Polish historian, they won the field. Why was as the clip seemed to suggest, why was it a wasted victory? They didn't go to the chief headquarters, Malbork Castle, in time. What happened why did they wait so long on the battlefield? A few days.
Due to the losses, which for such a medieval battle were enormous on the Teutonic side, there were several reasons for this. First, knights dressed in white cloaks with black crosses were regarded with particular hatred, and usually they were not taken prisoner but murdered on the spot, contrary to knightly traditions. Also, the second phase of the battle took place in the Teutonic camp, surrounded by wagons, where the knights and infantry had taken shelter. Capturing this camp also involved suffering heavy losses. For this reason, the tired army, which also had to take prisoner several thousand enemies, had to spend some time counting losses, treating the wounded, preparing for the journey ahead. This delay gave time for the remaining Teutonic Knights, scattered throughout their state, to reach Malbork and prepare it for defence.
And then a few more wars between the Teutonic Knights occurred over the next few hundred years. Let's move on as we close our discussion to 20th century. And the Germans have, the German Empire has a great victory in 1914 over the Russians in northern Poland or East Prussia. And they call it the Battle of Tannenberg, their name for Grunwald. And it's seen as a revenge for 1410. Are the memories of this particular battle so important in German understanding and Polish understanding that it lasts hundreds of years?
One could say that for the 19th and 20th century German state, this battle was a great thorn in history because it was Prussia that united Germany, and the Prussian state was a remnant of the Teutonic Order. After 1525, when it underwent secularization, it became a secular duchy. The rulers of Prussia became de facto loyal subjects of the Polish king. It was difficult to reconcile this with the later history of Germany, when these very subjects, the Hohenzollerns, brought about the rise of the power of the Kingdom of Prussia and the unification of the mighty Great Germany. Here, they simply replaced the former enemy in German propaganda, that is, Poles, Lithuanians, and Lithuanian Ruthenians, with Russians, in order to portray a triumph for Germanization over Slavdom, which in turn was a reminiscence of various 19th century archaeological research or various racial theories, which of course had nothing to do with European universalism.
The final question to you, what is the current state of the historiography about the battle and about its consequences in Poland, Lithuania, Russia, as well with the Teutonic Knights, and in Germany? A brief tour d'horizon as to how this battle is viewed.
Polish and Lithuanian historiography don't differ much from each other. Of course, the Lithuanians place much greater emphasis on the contribution of Duke Witold. As for the Russians, oddly enough, they also claim to have taken part in the Battle of Grunwald, because the so-called Smolensk regiments were involved in the battle. However, the Duchy of Smolensk in this period was a vassal of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, later becoming its part, and didn't have anything in common with Moscow until 1514. When it was conquered and incorporated into the Muscovite state. As for the Germans, well, of course, it depends on which Germans you ask. Germans from Gdansk, Pomerania that is, from Royal Prussia, forming the Lizard Union, or later the Prussian Union, well, of course, they strove to unite with Poland. They saw their economic interest in this, that this began to be perceived completely differently from the 19th century onward, when the dominant narrative was imposed by Prussia.
On that note, Tomasz Szumański, thank you very much for joining us. Fantastic conversation.
Thank you very much.
So that's all we have time for today. Join us next time, you know when, Tuesdays, 21:35, 35 minutes past 9 CEST. Join us then.